So we continue our exploration of epistemology, and one of the things we've seen is that many questions can be raised, and there are many things that can be doubted, even things that we take for granted. Among those things that can be doubted, some of the most important questions involve the nature of the physical world. Can we really trust our experiences within the physical world? Can we trust that when we experience physical things, that we are getting accurate information from those things? Can we trust that our experiences can actually give us knowledge? But there's a deeper question still, and we saw Descartes wrestling with it in the last class. Can we even really be certain that what we think is the physical world is there? Can we know that there is a material realm? In the last class, we met René Descartes, who says, I can know that I am a thinking thing that exists. I can also analyze the contents of my thoughts and come to realize that I have conceptions of ideas that do not belong to me. They must have come from an awareness of something beyond me. I have conceptions of perfection and things which would only describe a being than which nothing is greater. Although he does not use that language is associated with a very specific argument for God. Nevertheless, Descartes is pointing to the same thing, our conceptions of perfection, the being that we call God. We have an awareness, an idea within us already. Since the perfection of that being, the being than which nothing is greater, includes goodness, we can therefore trust that God would not manipulate or deceive us. Thus, what we think we experience, that is the material world, we can trust to be there. So Descartes argues for certainty, and we can trust that there is a physical realm, but he has to argue from the most foundational thing, the confidence that we exist as an I that is not material, and he argues through God to a certainty for the physical world. So we can be certain that there is a physical world and that we exist and that we experience and interact with the physical world. However, very importantly, we are not the same stuff as the physical world. The I that forms my most foundational piece of certainty is not a physical thing. So we exist as immaterial beings somehow connected to a material body and interacting with a physical world that we can trust is there. This immaterial I, somehow curiously existing within the mechanistic matter of a body, has been sometimes called the ghost within the machine.
How do you know you're real? It's an obvious question until you try to answer it. But let's take it seriously. How do you really know you exist? In his Meditations on First Philosophy, René Descartes tried to answer that very question, demolishing all his preconceived notions and opinions to begin again from the foundations. All his knowledge had come from his sensory perceptions of the world, same as you, right? You know you're watching this video with your eyes, hearing it with your ears. Your senses show you the world as it is. They aren't deceiving you, but sometimes they do. You might mistake a person far away for someone else, or you're sure you're about to catch a fly ball and it hits the ground in front of you. But come on, right here and now, you know what's right in front of you is real. Your eyes, your hands, your body, that's you. Only crazy people would deny that, and you know you're not crazy. Anyone who'd doubt that must be dreaming. Oh no. What if you're dreaming? Dreams feel real. You can believe you're swimming, flying, or fighting off monsters with your bare hands when your real body is lying in bed. No. When you're awake, you know you're awake. But when you aren't, you don't know you aren't. So you can't prove you aren't dreaming. Maybe the body you perceive yourself to have isn't really there. Maybe all of reality, even its abstract concepts like time, shape, color, and number, are false. all just deceptions concocted by an evil genius. No, seriously. Descartes asks if you can disprove the idea that an evil genius demon has tricked you into believing reality is real. Perhaps this diabolical deceiver has duped you. The world, your perceptions of it, your very body, you can't disprove that they're all just made up. And how could you exist without them? You couldn't. So, you don't. Life is but a dream. And I bet you aren't rowing the boat merrily at all, are you? No, you're rowing it wearily, like the duped, non-existent doof you are/aren't. Do you find that convincing? Are you persuaded? If you aren't, good. If you are, even better. Because by being persuaded, you would prove that you're a persuaded being. You can't be nothing if you think you're something, even if you think that something is nothing. Because no matter what you think, you're a thinking thing. Or as Descartes put it, I think, therefore I am. And so are you. Really.
So perhaps we have arguably solved one problem. Perhaps we can trust that the physical world is there. This does not necessarily mean that we can trust our experiences within it, that we can trust that we actually acquire knowledge when experiencing the physical world. When you look at or experience an object, how do you know that you see objects as they are? Even if we can move beyond the question of how we know that the object even exists, that the whole experience is not just within our mind, this does not mean that we have answered the question as to whether we can trust our senses when we experience the world that we may now be certain is there. Look at this picture. Which of these lines is longer, the top or the bottom? Now look at this picture with two arrows of a sort. Ignoring the tips and only looking at the lines in the center, are these lines the same length, or is one of the lines longer than the other? Concerning the picture of the railroad track, in fact, both lines are the same length. Yet, when we look at a set of railroad tracks like this, there is nothing about our immediate sense experience that would tell us that the horizontal lines closest to us are the same length as those in the distant horizon. Similarly, with the other picture, both of the lines are the same length, yet the lines with the extensions outward rather than inward give us the impression that the line is actually shorter. Now, impressions are really important when it comes to sense experience. Speaking of impressions, check out this famous picture of a duck. How do we know that it is a duck and not a rabbit? We talked about why this dress is so controversial and how we can all have the same experience and yet walk away with different impressions of the experience. We learned that our mind tries to interpret certain aspects of our experience for us. For example, in this cube, you probably see an orange square on the darkened side of the cube. In actuality, it's the same color as the centerpiece on the top of the cube. Now you can see it is actually brown. However, our brains recognize the shadow and interpret the brown square on the dark side of the cube as only appearing brown because of the shadow. Thus, our brain attempts to correct the image by compensating for the shadow. Do you see an older woman here? Or perhaps a young beauty queen? What about here? Do you see an old woman with a large nose and chin looking toward the left of the screen? Or a young, petite woman with a really large coat who is glancing toward the back of the screen?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
The Doppler Effect. In Sheldon's words,
it's the apparent change in the frequency of a wave caused by relative motion between the source of the wave and the observer.
The Doppler effect is perhaps best explained visually. So here's a thing that is emitting waves. It could be a fire truck emitting sound, it could be a star emitting light, it could be a duck creating ripples on a pond. Those are all waves, and they all look something like this. We see the Doppler effect happening when the thing that is emitting waves moves. In the direction it's moving, the wavefronts bunch up, and behind it they spread out. If our object is moving towards a stationary observer, these bunched up waves are observed at a high frequency, and if the object is moving away from a stationary observer, the waves are observed at a lower frequency. So that is the Doppler effect, the apparent change in the frequency of a wave caused by relative motion between the source of the wave and the observer. It makes sense, but it gets interesting when you consider some of its applications. So let's say you are standing in the middle of a road. That's you, and a car drives past you very fast. As it does so, it honks its horn, because you're standing in the middle of the road. The horn to you might sound something like this. So it starts at a high pitch and moves to a lower pitch, even though from the driver's perspective, the horn is playing the same pitch the entire time. So what's going on? As the vehicle's coming towards you, the sound waves that it's emitting bunch up, and so are delivered to you at a higher frequency, which you interpret as a higher pitch, because the frequency of sound waves is pitch. And then when the vehicle passes you and is moving away from you, the sound waves spread out, and so you hear them at a lower frequency, a lower pitch. So that's how the Doppler effect works with sound. It also affects another kind of wave, light. So let's say you look out your observatory and you see a star. Just like the car's sound waves, if the star is moving towards you, even just a little bit, the light waves that it emits will be bunched up, meaning that you see the light at a higher frequency than it actually is. Frequency in sound is pitch, so what does it mean for light? Well, if we look at our handy pocket electromagnetic spectrum chart, we'll see that a small change in frequency for visible light will change its color. Higher frequency light waves means bluer light, and lower frequency light waves means redder light. This is called redshift, and it may possibly be among the weirdest and coolest things of all time. Stars, or anything that you can see, change color depending on their relative motion to you. Of course, you can't see this minute difference with your eyes, but astronomers with the right equipment can use this effect to tell whether stars are moving away from or towards Earth. As it turns out, almost everything we can see in the universe is moving away from us very quickly, which is both an important piece of evidence for the Big Bang and an indication that the Earth might get very lonely in the distant future.
In the last class, we framed the great debate of the Enlightenment between rationalism and empiricism, and we looked more closely at the rationalist camp. Today, we're going to look more closely at the empiricist camp, beginning with John Locke, and then we will see what George Berkeley has to say. While Francis Bacon, who is credited with developing the scientific method, is considered by many to be the father of empiricism, John Locke, one of the most influential philosophers in the Enlightenment, stands out as one of the most significant of the early British empiricists. Among other things, Locke was interested in understanding our understanding, how it works, what materials it has to work with, and how far it can reach. He assumes that experience is the source of all our ideas. He distinguishes between sensation and reflection, and simple ideas versus complex ideas. He was especially interested in digging at the nature of our idea of substance. He concludes that we are not born with innate ideas. Rather, we are born as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and all of our knowledge comes to us through sense data. We are the tabula rasa upon which our experience is written. According to Locke, our ideas come from only two sources, sensation and reflection. Sensation refers to the direct experience of physical objects through our senses. Reflection refers to the ideas that we get from reflecting upon our own mental operations. Now, here's where Locke gets deep. We often experience different qualities taken together. For example, sweetness and redness may be found accompanying the thing that we call apple, but it is at least possible that such things happen together by accident. Therefore, we cannot say that redness is actually in and part of the essence of that object. We can only say that there is a substratum, a substance, including primary qualities such as body and mass, of which we are aware, through which these accidental qualities, secondary qualities like color and sound, are experienced. Yet we can never experience those substances directly, that is, isolated from these other accidental qualities. Now, this can be a difficult concept to grasp, but that thing which we call an apple is not red and sweet, nor green nor tart, in and of itself. It is only a substance, which we do not really know in and of itself, which happens to have secondary qualities or properties of redness and sweetness. So equality refers to the power an object holds that is capable to produce in us an idea. Primary qualities produce in us a sensation that resembles the aspects of the substratum, or the experienced thing, directly. Secondary qualities produce ideas within us that do not refer directly to that substratum, but instead refer to additional variables existing within our experience of that substratum. So primary qualities are the qualities a thing actually has, like mass. Secondary qualities are additional, but non-essential, qualities of our experience that are somehow caused from our encounter with those primary qualities. When I experience a red circle, the sensation produced in me of circularity is a primary quality, while the sensation of redness is a secondary quality. Redness is not essential to the nature of that circular substratum. It merely refers to a quality that we also happen accidentally to experience alongside our direct experience of an object's primary qualities. There's a fantastic text that I highly recommend. It's called The Great Conversation by Norman Melchard. And in it, Melchard explains what Locke is getting at here quite well. He says, gold is not yellow. That color is not one of its primary qualities, does not belong to it, apart from us. The primary qualities that are actually in gold are its extension, its shape, its motion, and its impenetrability. Gold does have a secondary quality, the power to produce yellow sensations in creatures such as ourselves. The idea is that the primary qualities of gold, when joined with the primary qualities of light, of the eye, and of the nervous system of the human being, bring about, somehow, an experience of color. Now, the fact that we will always experience, accidentally, these secondary qualities along with whatever object we are attending to at any given moment means that we will never be able to really experience an object with those qualities removed in order to know the object in and of itself, which is why Locke says that the substratum, the thing in and of itself, removed from all the other stuff that accidentally accompanies it, will always remain unknown to us. That is, we may be able to experience certain things in certain ways with other adjoining qualities, but we will never be able to experience a thing as it is in and of itself. Now, if you've taken my ethics class or a class in politics, or you know anything about Locke, it may seem odd for him to headline the list of empiricists here. We will meet some staunch empiricists who say if you can't prove it through empirical science, you can't claim it as knowledge, but Locke was not quite that hardcore. He was willing to allow that while we do not have innate ideas, there are some types of knowledge that we can acquire through rational intuition. Belief in God would fall into this category. Locke argues that our idea of the soul is as clear as our idea of material substance, and our idea of personal identity is founded in our consciousness, especially in memory. We'll get to that problem later. He also clarified that when we speak of things, words just stand for ideas that are in the mind, and knowledge involves an agreement and disagreement among ideas. Now, there are different types of agreements and disagreements. Real existence is known by intuition. In our own case, we know that we exist. Real existence is known by rational demonstration, in God's case, and real existence is known by sensation, in the case of material things. So when it comes to our experiences in the physical world, he is an empiricist through and through. Yet he understands that if there exist different types of stuff, material stuff and immaterial stuff, or my personal self and persons beyond me, then it makes sense that it would require different modes of knowing and investigation to come to understand each of those things respectively. So Locke has given us much to think about from the empiricist perspective, and while he still found room for rational insights and intuitions, many philosophers who come after Locke, who raise high the banner of empiricism, are going to allow little to no room for rational intuitions. The only knowledge that we can have for them will come exclusively from our sense data. Well, following John Locke, the next significant figure in British empiricism was an Irishman named George Berkeley. He was a bishop who applied empiricism full force in order to argue, interestingly, that when we apply empiricism full force, we are necessarily forced to a conclusion that there is no actual material world. Now, Berkeley's ideas, deep as they are actually a lot of fun to ponder. So let's dive in. He was a defender of common sense. Arguing against both Descartes and Locke, he held that philosophers have violated common sense, thereby furnishing the ammunition for skeptics and atheists to use in raising these seemingly puzzling epistemic questions. In actuality, he says, philosophers tend to take the existence of matter as matter of fact, when, in fact, its actual existence has not been proved. Now, Locke had articulated a doctrine of abstract ideas. So we experience various perceptions and we form particular ideas. Our particular ideas relate to those individual context-specific perceptions. I experienced a cat in this context. I experienced a cat in this context. And here's this cat in another context. And then through a process in which our mind removes context, the mind forms abstractions of ideas from those perceptions. Or as some have said it, perception becomes conception through omission of the context. So each individual experience of this cat and that cat and another cat, from these particular ideas, we are able to form the abstract idea of cats. And that abstract idea can apply to any particular idea that we might have. Now, to the critic, it might be reasonable to suppose that we do indeed form some sorts of abstractions based upon our experiences in the world. For example, if you are speaking to me of unicorns, can I make sense of that without having first experienced horns or horses? But recall that on Locke's view, we only get our ideas about experience from experience, and yet when we experience an object like a red apple, we are able to pull out these different abstractions. We form the abstraction of certain primary qualities, and we form the abstract concepts of certain secondary qualities. Here, Berkeley is going to take issue. Perhaps Locke is not being a consistent empiricist.
The attack on resemblance, on the resemblance thesis, naturally leads us to an attack based on our lack of understanding of the qualities concerned. So here you can see empiricism playing a big role. Remember, Locke is very notable for his empiricism, for insisting that all our ideas must derive from experience. All our ideas are copied, as it were, from experience. Berkeley and Hume both follow him in this. But if our ideas are copied from experience, then it seems that our ideas of primary qualities must be infused with the experiential qualities through which we experience them. When I see a shape, a circular shape, I see it as coloured. It's only because it's coloured that I can see it at all. Well, if that's so, doesn't it follow that my idea of a shape must intrinsically be coloured? And if secondary qualities, like colour, cannot exist except in a mind, then the same is going to go for the primary qualities, isn't it? Well, maybe not. Why can't I see a yellow circle, a blue circle, a red circle, and so forth, and then form the abstract idea of a circle? Just a circle, not with any particular colour. Why can't I do that? In which case, that idea of circularity is not going to be, as it were, contaminated with subjective secondary qualities. Maybe I can form the idea of something which is circular but not coloured. Well, Berkeley and Hume both attack Locke, saying that we cannot do this. And they attack Locke on the doctrine of abstraction. Now, you may remember, Locke's doctrine of abstraction is that we form general ideas by leaving out detail. So, for example, a child, the first man that a child gets to know is probably his father. So the child forms the idea of his father. Then he begins to meet other men and notices their similarity and notices their difference, no doubt, from the women that he meets. And then he forms the abstract idea of a man by leaving out details. So some men he meets are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are thin, some are dark, some are fair, some have beards, some don't. The child forms the abstract idea of a man by leaving out all the distinctive features and just retaining the general features of manness. So that's Locke's doctrine of abstraction. Berkeley very strongly attacks it. He says you can't do that. There's no way you can form the idea of a man who is neither tall nor short, nor fat nor thin, nor with a beard nor without one. That's inconsistent. You cannot imagine such a thing because such a thing cannot exist in reality, any more than you can form the idea of a triangle which is neither equilateral nor isosceles nor scalene. It's impossible to do these things. And when you read Berkeley, you might wonder, why is he making such a big thing about abstraction? Why is it so important to him? Well, the reason that it's important to him comes back to this business of primary and secondary qualities. Berkeley wants to say that I cannot form the idea of a circle which has no colour. And if I can't form the idea of a primary quality circle without the secondary quality colour, and if all my ideas of secondary qualities are intrinsically mental, they cannot exist outside a mind, then it follows that I cannot even conceive of a primary quality which can exist independently of a mind. I cannot form that conception. And that's why he puts such a lot of emphasis on it. If you read Berkeley's principles, most of the introduction is devoted to an attack on abstraction. That's why.
So Berkeley really goes after this aspect of Locke's theory as incoherent, and he offers what he believes to be a more satisfactory account of how general words or ideas actually work. He argues that, insofar as we know, everything that exists either as a perceiving thing, Descartes' the I, which is a spirit of sorts, non-material, or a perceived thing. The existence of spirits or perceivers is clear to us. I am one, as I know myself to be perceiving. What is really in question, then, has to do with the nature of the thing which is perceived. As demonstrated by Descartes, the fact of an existing spirit is the most clear and distinct information that we have. For everything else, says Berkeley, esse est percipi, or to be is to be perceived. Consider, for example, the existence of a table. A table is a sensible thing. Sensible things are perceived by sense. Whatever is perceived by sense is a sensation. So no sensation can exist unperceived. So no table can exist unperceived. To say that a table exists when it is not perceived is to say that this table, which exists only as perceived, exists also unperceived. Isn't this a contradiction? This is an example of the reductio ad absurdum. The point is to show that if we can only know the I, the existing perceiver, and that which is perceived, then we cannot actually know anything unperceived. So the problem is this: if I'm standing in a room observing a table, I can be certain that I exist as the perceiver, and I can know that the table exists, for I perceive it to exist. The problem is, when I walk out the room, how can I know that the table continues to exist? I cannot know that just because I perceived it while in the room, it continues to exist once I have left the room. For, don't forget, we've said that knowledge only comes from experience. And the knowledge I acquire from experience involves the I and what I perceive. I have no experience of what is going on once I am not there to perceive it, so I cannot conclude that it still exists. Now, perhaps you've discovered a way out of this. Just because I've left the room, you may still be in the room, so you can see the table. And Berkeley would agree with you. Yes, the table remains in existence because there remains a perceiver able to know it. But once all perceivers have left the room, we cannot know that something exists. If we truly adopt empiricism full force, then we can only safely say that any given thing, like a table in the room, continues to exist because, and only because, there remains a perceiver to continue observing a thing once all other perceivers have ceased their observations, and the thing in question no longer lies within their direct experience. So in disagreement with Locke, Berkeley is saying that the primary qualities of any given physical object are in the same boat as those secondary qualities. And there is a problem when we try to turn our idea of a thing, for example, our idea of the table we experienced in the room, into actual things. For example, a table we do not observe remaining within a room we cannot observe. Now, there is a way out of this, he observes. Any created thing comes from the mind of the creator, and God is able to observe all created things, everywhere, at any given time, all the time. Now, here, with assurance of God's existence, we are safe to rest assured that when we walk out of the room, there remains a perceiver. To be is to be perceived. Well, all things remain within the perception of God's perspective. Thus, a perceiver continues to perceive the table even as we walk out, and it no longer remains within our experience. So God's perceiving of things is really the only guarantee that we have of a thing's objectivity or its continual existence beyond our perspective. So Berkeley is convinced that an empirical argument can be made to show that primary qualities are mind relative, just like secondary qualities. To build such an argument, just consult your common sense experience. When do you conclude that something exists? You do so when you perceive it in your existence. When do you conclude that something does not exist? When it has not been perceived. Thus, Berkeley famously concludes to be is to be perceived. He then makes the profound move. Based upon that admission, why suppose that the chair you are sitting in continues to exist after you leave the room, and there is no one left to perceive it? Ideas must be caused by themselves, material substances, finite beings, or God. An idea cannot cause itself. Given that we already have proof that to be is to be perceived, material substances cannot really be said to exist. They are only ideas that we have. You and I are passive to our experiences. We do not cause our own experience, nor anyone else's experience. So, all things must exist in the mind of God, the only option remaining. Now, Berkeley is not really denying that there is a material world, although he is playing that game. Rather, given that we base our certainty of existence upon our perceptions, yet perceptions cannot continue when we leave the room, he is asking, what grounds have we to conclude that things continue to exist once we leave the room? Well, none. Based on our own admissions of common sense realism, built upon empiricism, a material thing can only really be known to exist so long as it is perceived. It is an idea, and ideas require a mind.
So Berkeley concludes from this argument that bodies independent of mind are literally inconceivable. You cannot even conceive of an object existing outside a mind. Now, if that's right, then it follows that the world has to consist ultimately of mental entities, spirits and ideas. So you get to Berkeley's famous idealism. Now, most of us probably are not going to be very attracted by idealism. It seems the kind of extravagant metaphysical nonsense that philosophers love spouting, but no commonsensical person could possibly believe. Samuel Johnson is famously said to have discussed Berkeley in these terms. Kicking a stone, he said, "I refute him thus." And the idea was that the solidity of the stone clearly shows that real physical objects exist outside minds. Well, suppose we want to have a rather more considered reaction to Berkeley. The right thing to do seems to be just to concede that our notion of body is not likely to be ultimately composed of elements that we can fully understand in the kinds of terms that Locke thought we could. If we try to form an idea of body as consisting entirely of properties that resemble our ideas, then we have this problem of understanding what it is that fills the space. And maybe we just have to concede that in the case of a property like solidity, we just can't do that. We have to attribute body as having a something I know not what that fills the space. Is that a problem? Well, Berkeley and co. wanted to say that was a problem, that a theory that attributes a something I know not what is no theory at all. But actually, we can see with the progress of modern science that this has become a much more familiar idea. Okay, at the time, the best physical theory, the corpuscularian theory, had this interesting coincidence that the properties attributed to matter were at the same time properties that seemed intrinsically intelligible, that made sense. Again, Locke wanted to say, that in praising the corpuscularian hypothesis, he praises the fact that it is so intelligible. Shape, size, motion, these are things that we can understand readily enough. And it seems to make sense when one thing bashes into another and makes it move. It's got that kind of intrinsic intelligibility. So we naturally get the idea that the fundamental properties of matter, the properties in terms of which we're explaining everything, including matter's appearance, those properties are ones which are intelligible to us. Then we look critically at solidity and we find, actually, maybe it's not so simple. Maybe we, in order to draw a distinction between matter and empty space, we have to attribute this crucial property, solidity, or something like that, which is a property that we can only understand indirectly, in dispositional terms, in terms of what it does. We have to say there's this something we know not what that keeps other something we know not what's out. And that looks at first to be undesirable. But then you look at modern theories and you see things like mass, charge, spin, strangeness, all these funny properties that we start attributing to fundamental particles. We come up with things like quantum mechanics, where we more or less have to give up any attempt to understand the fundamental properties of things in terms that we find naturally intelligible. And we have to face up to the fact that as evolved creatures, our senses are naturally fitted to understand the world at one level, but that doesn't mean by any means that our intuitive understanding is going to work all the way down. So maybe we just have to accept that our best theories are quite likely to attribute fundamental properties to objects which are radically different from anything that we are intuitively aware of. So we do have to say, well, there's this something I know not what which has these properties. I call it charge. It can be either positive or negative. It has the property that a positive attracts a negative and a positive repels a positive and so forth. All I can do is give you equations at best which describe how these things behave. But if you say, what is it? All I can say is, well, it's a something I know not what that has these properties. So at the time, that looked unacceptable. I think the reason it looked unacceptable because the scientists of the time had this illusion, a very attractive illusion, that the world was going to be comprehensible. And the illusion was fostered by having a physical theory which seemed to be so intuitively neat and nice. The crack there comes with solidity. If you really push at that, you come to a quite different conclusion about the way in which what an ideal science can be. It cannot attribute ultimate properties that we will necessarily find intelligible.
So John Locke and the empiricists after him insisted that our knowledge of our experiences within the world come solely from our sensations. The ideas that we have are derived from our sense experience. In contrast, George Berkeley adopts empiricism as a methodology in order to work his way toward the philosophical conclusion known as idealism, that everything that can be known is ultimately grounded within the realm of ideas. It might also be of interest to note here that while Berkeley was making a very different move than Descartes, Like Descartes, he saw God as a necessary variable for securing our certainty as it relates to the physical world. Next time, we will meet the empiricist known as the wrecking ball of philosophical history, and also the philosopher who thereafter attempted to bridge this Enlightenment divide between rationalism and empiricism.